The portal did not deliver him gently. There was no gradual transition, no slow bleeding of one world into another. One moment, Kratos stood at the threshold between realms, Atreus's voice echoing through the dimensional tier like a lifeline, and the next the portal collapsed, folding in on itself with a sound like reality breaking, and cast him into darkness so absolute it felt physical. He landed hard, harder than he should have, given his divine constitution, as if this world itself rejected his presence with greater violence than before. The ground beneath him was not the soft forest floor of Fangorn or the golden plains of Rohan. It was cracked earth, blackened and dead, the soil so thoroughly corrupted that nothing grew from it, not even weeds, not even the stubborn wildflowers that pushed through battlefield mud weeks after the slaughter ended. Nothing. Kratos rose slowly, weapons materializing in his hands with the instinct of a warrior who had learned that hesitation meant death. The Leviathan axe hummed with cold energy, frost forming along its blade in patterns that seemed almost anxious. The blades of chaos stirred beneath their wrappings, chains rattling softly against his forearms as if warning him. He scanned his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated 100 hostile territories. He was standing in what had once been farmland. He could tell by the remnants of stone walls, the ghost of irrigation channels carved into the dead earth, the occasional rusted tool half buried in the blackened soil. Someone had worked this land once, had planted and tended and harvested here. Now it was dead, not abandoned, dead. The distinction mattered. Abandoned land grew wild with weeds and reclamation, nature asserting itself over human absence. This land had been killed deliberately, the life scoured from it as if by some terrible force that did not merely ignore nature but actively destroyed it. The sky above him was wrong. In the Middle-earth, he remembered, the sky had been vast and blue and alive with moving clouds, with the wheel of stars at night that Legolas had named with quiet reverence. Even during the War of the Ring, even with Sauron's shadow pressing from the east, the sky had retained something of its essential character. This sky was a bruise, purple-black at the horizon, deepening to near darkness at the zenith despite what should have been midday. A permanent haze obscured the sun, reducing it to a pale smear of sickly yellow light that illuminated without warming. It was the sky of a world in the final stages of dying, a world whose connection to whatever divine light had sustained it was being systematically severed. Kratos had seen something like this once before. In the aftermath of his war against Olympus, when the gods died and their gifts to humanity died with them, the crops failing, the seas churning, the storms without end. He had done that. His vengeance had stripped the world of its divine sustenance, and he had been forced to confront the full weight of what his rage had cost. He had sworn never to allow such destruction again. And yet here it was, not his doing this time, but the result was hauntingly familiar. He began walking east, toward where he knew or remembered Gondor lay. The landscape revealed its horrors gradually, like a wound exposing layers of damage as bandages were removed. The first village he passed had been burned, but not recently. The ruins were old, the char weathered by years of that sickly rain. Whatever had happened here, it had happened long before his arrival. The second village was worse, not burned but occupied or had been. The buildings were intact but transformed, their walls bearing crude markings in a script he did not recognize but whose nature he understood immediately. These were the marks of conquest, of ownership, of a power declaring that everything within sight belonged to it. Chains hung from door frames. Iron collars rusted in doorways. The village had not been destroyed. It had been converted into a cage. Currently empty. Whatever prisoners had been held here were gone, moved deeper into the shadow that dominated the eastern horizon. That shadow, permanent, physical, a wall of darkness that rose from the earth like a storm frozen in place, was Mordor's influence spreading. Not the natural shadow of distance or weather, but the active, malevolent darkness of Sauron's complete dominion over a conquered land. Kratos stopped at the edge of the ruined village and crouched, examining tracks in the blackened mud. Booted feet, large and heavy, orcs, moving in organized formation rather than the chaotic stampede of a raiding party. These were patrols, regular, disciplined, covering specific routes. The tracks were perhaps 6 hours old. Sauron had not simply won. He had organized his victory with the meticulous efficiency of someone who intended his dominion to be permanent. The sound reached him before the sight. A low, rhythmic sound carried on the dead air like distant thunder. As Kratos moved toward higher ground, a low ridge that had once marked the boundary between two farms, the source became visible, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear. He had burned that weakness out of himself in the Greek underworld, but something adjacent to it, a cold recognition of scale, of the true dimensions of the catastrophe he had stepped into. The road below the ridge had once been a trading route, connecting the villages of Gondor's outer provinces to Minas Tirith. He knew this because Aragorn had described it during their night conversations on the ride from Edoras. The ranger had known every road, every settlement, every ford and bridge in this land with the intimacy of someone who had spent decades watching over it from the shadows. That road was now a slave highway. Columns of people stretched as far as the eye could see in both directions, thousands of them, shuffling forward under the weight of chains and despair, their clothing reduced to rags, their faces carrying the hollowed expression of those who had surrendered hope so completely that its absence no longer registered as loss. Men and women of Gondor and Rohan mixed with halflings, hobbits, Kratos recognized, remembering Gandalf's description, their normally cheerful faces masks of exhaustion and grief. Flanking the columns were orcs, not the crude, disorganized creatures he had cut down at Helm's Deep, but disciplined soldiers bearing the eye of Sauron on their shields, moving with the practiced efficiency of conquerors who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. Overseers rode atop massive wargwolves, their elevated position allowing them to survey the entire column, whips cracking when movement slowed. At the column's rear, something moved that made even Kratos reassess his immediate tactical options. A troll, not the cave trolls of Moria that the Fellowship had described, but a war troll, armored in black iron, standing 15 feet tall and carrying a chain attached to a rolling cage. In that cage, barely visible through the iron bars, were children. The rage that had been building since he landed hit critical mass. He controlled it. Barely, but he controlled it. Charging a column of thousands, no matter how great his strength, would result in the deaths of the very people he sought to protect. The slaves would be killed in the chaos. The children in that cage would die when the troll fell. He needed information before action. He needed to understand the shape of this world before he could begin to change it. With the discipline learned across centuries of warfare, Kratos pulled back from the ridge and moved parallel to the column, tracking it at a safe distance while cataloging what he observed. The orcs communicated through hand signals as much as speech, suggesting a level of military training that exceeded anything Saruman had achieved with his Uruk-hai. Their equipment was standardized, same shields, same spear design, same dark armor, indicating centralized production on an industrial scale. Sauron had not merely conquered Middle-earth. He had begun to industrialize it, to convert its resources into the machinery of permanent dominion. An hour of tracking led Kratos to a junction where the slave column met a supply convoy moving in the opposite direction, wagons loaded with weapons, food, and materials moving toward the darkness in the east. The exchange point was guarded by a larger force, and at its center stood a figure that made him pause. Not an orc, a man, or something that had once been a man, before shadow and corruption and the slow poison of Sauron's will had worked their transformation. He wore the black armor of a high commander, bearing the rank insignia of what appeared to be a regional overseer. His eyes held the dead flatness of someone who had surrendered their will so completely that nothing remained behind them but obedience. One of the men who had chosen Sauron's service over death. There had always been such people, those who rationalized collaboration as pragmatism, who told themselves that survival required accommodation, who woke in the middle of the night and felt something that might have been shame if they had not worked so hard to kill it. Kratos had no compassion for such choices, but he had use for such people. He moved with the silence learned in decades of assassination and stealth, approaching the commander's position from a blind angle, using the supply wagons as cover. When he emerged from the shadows directly behind the man, the commander began to turn, some survival instinct firing too late, and found a hand closing around his throat with enough force to communicate the precise calibration of threat without causing permanent damage. "You will answer my questions," Kratos said quietly, his voice stripped of everything except cold certainty. "Completely, accurately, and then I will decide what happens to you." The commander's dead eyes showed the first spark of genuine emotion he had probably felt in years: absolute terror. "Where," Kratos continued, his grip tightening fractionally, "are the resistance fighters, the survivors of Rohan, the elves, anyone who has not surrendered to your master?" The man's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then, with the desperate calculation of someone choosing between certain death and possible survival, he began to talk. What he revealed painted a picture darker than even the corrupted sky above them. Minas Tirith, Barad Minas now, the Tower of Shadow, stood as Sauron's western throne, the great white city transformed into a fortress of darkness from which his will radiated across the conquered lands. Aragorn had been taken there in chains 2 years ago, kept alive as a symbol of defeat. The heir of Isildur, the man who would have been king, displayed as proof that even the mightiest could be broken. The Rohirrim were scattered but not destroyed. A resistance operated from the ruins of Helm's Deep, guerrilla fighters, desperate and dwindling, led by surviving members of the Fellowship. Their numbers were unknown, their effectiveness minimal, their hope nearly spent. Rivendell had fallen, Lothlorien had been burned, but the gray havens on the western coast still stood, beyond Sauron's reach for now, the last refuge of the elves, preparing their final departure from Middle-earth forever. Once they sailed, the last divine light in this world would extinguish. And somewhere beneath all of this, the commander whispered with the superstitious fear of someone who had overheard things he was not meant to hear. Something else was happening. In Mordor's deepest places, in the foundations of Barad-dûr itself, the ground trembled with a rhythm that had nothing to do with Sauron's industry or his armies. Something older than the Dark Lord stirred. Something that even Sauron's servants feared to name. Kratos released the commander, who crumpled to his knees, gasping. He looked up at the ashen warrior with those terrified, half-dead eyes. "What are you?" he whispered. "Your world's last chance," Kratos replied. "Tell your master I am here. Tell him the God-Killer has returned. And tell him," he paused, looking at the slave column still grinding past on the road, at the children in the iron cage, at everything Sauron had built on the ruins of everything worth preserving. "Tell him he should have made sure I reached home." He disappeared back into the shadows before the commander could recover enough to call for guards, moving westward toward the ruins of Helm's Deep and whatever remained of the people who had once stood beside him. Middle-earth had fallen. Its heroes were broken, captured, or fled. Its hope was a guttering flame in a hurricane. But the Ghost of Sparta had walked through the ruins of Olympus. He had survived the death of his own world's divine order. He had learned, at terrible cost, that some things were worth fighting for even when fighting seemed futile. He had arrived too late to prevent the fall. He would not be too late for what came next. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The ruins of Helm's Deep waited in the west, and in those ruins, Kratos hoped, waited the spark that would ignite Middle-earth's last fire. Helm's Deep in victory had been a fortress battered but unbowed, its walls scarred by battle but its spirit intact. The celebrating Rohirrim had filled its courtyards with song and weeping, the mingled sounds of grief and survival that defined every genuine triumph over impossible odds. Helm's Deep in defeat was something else entirely. Kratos approached from the western approach, using the mountain shadows as cover, moving with the careful patience of someone who had learned that speed without intelligence was simply a faster way to die. The fortress had been partially destroyed, siege weapons had collapsed 2 sections of the deeping wall, and the Hornburg's tower bore the marks of dragon fire, its upper levels reduced to jagged stone teeth against the bruised sky. But it had not been razed completely, and that fact told him something important. Sauron had chosen to leave it standing, partially at least. Why leave a potential fortress for enemies when you had the power to reduce it to rubble? The answer came to him as he studied the approach. The destruction was theatrical, calculated. Enough damage to demonstrate power, to communicate hopelessness, but not enough to eliminate the structure's tactical value. Sauron wanted the resistance to have somewhere to shelter, somewhere that felt like safety while remaining ultimately indefensible. He wanted them to gather in one place where they could be watched, cataloged, and crushed at his leisure. It was the strategy of someone who had already won, and was now simply enjoying the process of making that victory complete. Kratos filed that information away and continued his approach, watching for sentries. The resistance, if it existed here, would have lookouts, people desperate enough to maintain basic security despite dwindling numbers and eroding hope. He needed to find them without triggering whatever warning systems they had in place, because desperate people with failing hope were prone to shooting first and asking nothing afterward. The sentry found him instead. An arrow materialized from the shadows of a collapsed wall section, not aimed at him, but planted in the earth 6 inches from his left foot with precision that communicated both capability and restraint. A clear message. We see you, we could have killed you, we chose not to, but that calculation can change. The ash-skinned warrior, a voice said from the darkness above, carrying the musical cadence of elvish speech filtered through years of exhaustion and grief. I wondered if I was dreaming when the scouts reported you. Legolas descended from his position atop a crumbled section of wall with the fluid grace that distinguished his kind, though the movement was slower than Kratos remembered, burdened with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical weight. The elf looked fundamentally altered. Not aged, elves did not age, but diminished in some essential way, as if the light that had animated him was burning lower, conserving itself against a darkness that never retreated. His eyes, however, still held their ancient sharpness, and they studied Kratos now with an expression caught between desperate hope and the fear of allowing himself to feel it. You left, Legolas said. The portal took you, we all saw it close. The portal fractured, Kratos replied, scanning the shadows around them with habitual wariness. I did not arrive where I intended. No, Legolas agreed quietly. You arrived where you were needed, whether you believe in such things or not. He gestured toward the fortress interior. Come, there are others who should see you, though I warn you they are not as you remember them. The interior of Helm's Deep had been transformed into something that lived in the uncomfortable space between fortress and ruin and home. Sections had been reinforced with salvaged materials, rough repairs that lacked the craft of the original construction but served their purpose. Fires burned in carefully shielded alcoves, their light minimized to prevent observation from outside. The smell of smoke and unwashed bodies, and the particular desperation of people living beyond the edge of what they thought they could endure permeated everything. Perhaps 300 people occupied the space. Kratos had expected fighters, but the reality was more complicated and more heartbreaking. Yes, there were warriors among them. He could identify them by how they moved, how they positioned themselves near exits, how their hands never strayed far from weapons. But there were also civilians, families, children who had grown up knowing nothing but hiding and fear and the whispered stories of a world that used to exist before the shadow came. This was not an army. It was a refugee camp that had learned to fight. Gimli emerged from a side passage before Legolas could lead Kratos further, and the dwarf's reaction was the most unguarded thing Kratos had witnessed since arriving in this broken world. For one uncontrolled moment, Gimli's face cracked open with something raw and overwhelming, relief so profound it bordered on anguish, before the warrior's discipline slammed back into place and sealed it away. "You're real," Gimli said gruffly, his voice rougher than Kratos remembered. "Not a vision, not one of Sauron's tricks." "I am real," Kratos confirmed. The dwarf nodded once sharply and turned away before whatever threatened his composure could complete its breakthrough. "Right. Then you'd better come and see what's left of us. And Kratos," he paused without turning back, "prepare yourself. Much has changed." The war council, such as it was, gathered in what had once been the Hornburg's great hall. The ceiling was partially open to the sky where dragon fire had removed it, and someone had stretched salvaged canvas across the gap to keep the rain out, the material stained and sagging but functional. A map dominated the central table, but it was unlike the tactical maps Kratos had studied before the Battle of Pelennor Fields. This map showed a world under occupation. Mordor's red markings had spread across nearly every region, leaving only small pockets of white, the gray havens on the western coast, the ruins of Helm's Deep, scattered marks in the northern wilderness. Everything else had been consumed. Yoan stood at the map's edge, and she was the changed one that Legolas had warned him about. The fierce young warrior who had challenged Kratos by the fire on the march to Gondor, who had ridden disguised into battle and faced the Witch King. That woman still existed, but she had been layered over with something harder and colder and more dangerous. The idealism had not died exactly. It had been compressed under years of pressure into something denser, more concentrated, sharper at the edges. She looked at Kratos when he entered and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You're too late." "Perhaps," Kratos replied, "or perhaps not late enough. Tell me everything." What followed was the most comprehensive catalog of disaster he had ever been forced to absorb. Yoan spoke with the flat precision of someone who had processed their grief so many times that narrating catastrophe no longer required emotional energy. Frodo had failed at the crack of doom, not through weakness of character but through the simple, terrible mathematics of the ring's power. He had resisted longer than anyone had a right to expect. But in the end, at the precipice, the ring had claimed him. He had put it on. And in that moment, across the entirety of Middle-earth, Sauron had felt it and reached out with his full will and simply taken it back. Frodo was alive, Yoan said, her voice going carefully flat at this point. Alive and kept in Barad Minas as a different kind of symbol than Aragorn, not proof of defeat, but proof of corruption, of what the ring could do to even the purest heart. Sauron displayed him to delegations of conquered peoples to demonstrate that resistance was not merely futile but actively corruptive to those who attempted it. Sam had tried to follow, had gotten further than anyone expected, reaching the outer approaches of Barad Minas before being captured. His fate was unknown. Gandalf had fallen in single combat with Sauron himself, his divine fire finally spent against darkness too vast to overcome alone. His fall had taken something essential from the resistance beyond tactical capability. It had taken the sense that some powers in this world were specifically opposed to darkness, that the universe had invested in the outcome. Without Gandalf, it felt as if the universe had simply stopped caring. Aragorn remained alive in Barad Minas' deepest dungeons. This was deliberate, Yoan explained. Sauron kept him alive because dead, Aragorn was merely a martyr. Living, broken, imprisoned, he was something more useful, proof that even the heir of Isildur, even the greatest man of the age, could be made to kneel. "He has not knelt," said a new voice from the hall's shadowed edge. Kratos turned. A hobbit emerged from the shadows, older than any hobbit should look at his age, carrying wounds that had healed wrong and a grief that had not healed at all. Merry, Kratos remembered, one of the 4 hobbits who had accompanied the fellowship. He walked with a pronounced limp from an injury that had never received proper treatment, and one of his hands bore the scarring of severe burns. "Aragorn has not broken," Merry continued, his voice carrying a quiet stubbornness that reminded Kratos painfully of everything he had valued about this world's people. "We have ways of knowing, people inside who send messages. He is in pain, and he is imprisoned, and they have done things to him that I won't describe in front of the children." His eyes flicked briefly to the far corner where several young faces watched with wide, solemn eyes. "But he has not spoken the words Sauron wants from him. He has not acknowledged defeat. Every day he refuses is a message to those of us out here that it is still worth trying." "Then he is worth rescuing," Kratos said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who had considered something so many times, who had built and dismantled plans for it so repeatedly, that the mere suggestion carried the weight of all those failed attempts. "Barad Minas," Gimli said, spreading his thick hands on the map, "is not Helm's Deep. It is not Minas Tirith as it was. Sauron has had 5 years to fortify it according to his own designs, using labor and materials and dark engineering that we don't fully understand. The gates alone have been described by escapees as—" "I will handle the gates," Kratos said. Another silence, different quality this time. "There is more," Legolas said carefully, and his tone made Kratos focus fully on the elf. "Something Eowyn did not mention because we don't entirely understand it ourselves. The scouts report unusual seismic activity in Mordor. The ground trembles without cause. The orcs in the eastern regions are disturbed by it. Even they seem afraid, and they fear nothing except Sauron himself." "The commander I questioned mentioned something similar," Kratos said. "He called it something beneath Barad-dûr." Legolas and Gimli exchanged the look of people who had theorized about something without wanting to be correct. "We believe," Legolas said slowly, "that Sauron's complete victory has somehow called to something, that his dominion over all of Middle-earth has sent a signal into places beyond this world, and that signal has been answered." "By what?" Kratos asked, though something in the pattern already stirred a cold recognition in the back of his mind. "We don't know its name," Merry said quietly. "The oldest texts in what remains of Rivendell's library, the ones that Bilbo saved before the fall, speak of something before Sauron, before the dark things of this age. They call it the First Dark, the original shadow, the being that taught Sauron everything he knew about corruption and dominion. Morgoth. The name surfaced from the lore Gandalf had shared during their ride to Gondor, the original Dark Lord, cast into the void beyond the world's circles at the end of the First Age, his power so great that even the combined might of the Valar had barely been sufficient to imprison him. Sauron had been his lieutenant, his greatest servant, and had spent 3 ages of the world pursuing a shadow of his master's ambitions. If Morgoth was stirring, if Sauron's victory was somehow creating conditions for the original darkness to return, then defeating Sauron would not be enough. They would not merely be fighting to free Middle-earth from one Dark Lord. They would be fighting to prevent the return of the being who had created darkness itself. "How long," Kratos asked, "before this Morgoth fully wakes?" "We don't know," Legolas admitted. "Weeks, perhaps less." Kratos looked at the map, the red markings, the tiny white islands of resistance, the darkness that had consumed everything. 300 people, half of them civilians, hiding in a broken fortress against forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, against a Dark Lord in full possession of his power and his prize, against the potential awakening of something that made even that Dark Lord seem like a lesser threat. In Sparta, they had a word for situations like this. Not hopeless. Spartans did not acknowledge hopelessness as a concept. They called it clarifying. A situation so stripped of alternatives that the path forward became the only path, fear and doubt burned away by the simple mathematics of necessity. He turned from the map and looked at the people gathered in this broken hall, the elf carrying diminished light, the dwarf armoring himself in gruffness against grief, The warrior woman compressed into something harder than she had been by years of loss. The hobbit walking on a leg that would never fully heal, carrying wounds both visible and not. They had survived when survival seemed impossible. They had maintained resistance when resistance seemed pointless. They had kept faith with each other, and with the memory of a world worth fighting for, even when that world seemed irretrievably lost. "I need to know everything," Kratos said. "Every route into Barad Minas, every weakness in Sauron's patrol patterns, every contact you have inside, every resource you have available." He met each of their eyes in turn. "We are going to rescue Aragorn. We are going to destroy the One Ring, and we are going to do it before whatever stirs beneath Mordor wakes completely." "That's three impossible things," Gimli observed, "before what sounds like a very hard deadline." "I have done impossible things before," Kratos replied. "Not in a world where the impossible had already been attempted and failed," Eowyn said, but there was something different in her voice now. Not hope. She was too experienced with its costs to allow hope to ignite quickly, but something adjacent to it, the possibility of hope, which was perhaps more dangerous and more valuable. "Then we will do it differently this time," Kratos said simply. He sat down at the table, placed the Leviathan axe before him, and looked at the map with the cold clarity of someone who had planned sieges against the gates of heaven itself. "Begin." The war council of what remained of free Middle-earth leaned over their map in the guttering firelight, and for the first time in 5 years, the resistance began to plan not for survival, but for victory. Outside the broken walls of Helm's Deep, the dark sky pressed down on a conquered world. But inside, in the careful space between despair and determination, something fragile and precious was being rebuilt from scratch. Not hope yet, something that came before hope. The decision to try. The plan took 3 days to build and would take 1 night to execute. Kratos spent those 3 days learning the shape of his enemy's strength with the methodical thoroughness of a general who had sieged divine fortresses, and understood that the difference between victory and catastrophe was measured in details most warriors considered beneath their attention. He interrogated every scout, every former prisoner, every spy contact the resistance had cultivated inside Barad Minas and the surrounding occupied territories. He studied patrol patterns, shift changes, the architectural modifications Sauron had made to the transformed city, the positioning of the war trolls and the Nazgul, and the elite Uruk battalions that served as the Dark Lord's personal guard. What emerged from this intelligence gathering was both more and less encouraging than he had expected. More encouraging because Sauron, for all his terrible power and meticulous dominion, had made the fundamental error of all conquerors who believed victory permanent. He had stopped planning for resistance. The patrols were disciplined but predictable. The fortifications were formidable but designed to repel large conventional forces, not small infiltration teams. The Dark Lord's attention had turned increasingly inward, focused on whatever stirred beneath Barad-dûr's foundations, the trembling that had intensified over the 3 days of their planning, until it could be felt as a constant low vibration in the earth, like the heartbeat of something immense and terrible slowly returning to consciousness. Less encouraging because even accounting for these weaknesses, the assault on Barad Minas would require the resistance to operate at a level of coordinated precision far beyond what 300 exhausted, grieving fighters could reliably execute. The margins were razor-thin. The contingencies for failure were essentially non-existent. If any significant element went wrong, the entire plan collapsed, and the resistance, already nearly destroyed, would be finished. Kratos explained this to the War Council with complete honesty because he had learned that false hope was a more dangerous weapon than despair. False hope led people to take shortcuts, miss details, and rationalize away problems. Despair at least kept people alert. "You are describing a plan that requires everything to go right," Eowyn said. studying the map where Kratos had marked the infiltration routes in careful charcoal lines. "No," Kratos replied. "I am describing a plan where I absorb everything that goes wrong, and the rest of you complete the mission while I do." The silence that followed had a specific texture he recognized. The silence of people processing a statement that was simultaneously clarifying and deeply troubling. "You intend to be the distraction," Legolas said slowly. "Not merely a distraction, the distraction. You intend to draw Sauron's direct attention." "His eye cannot be in two places simultaneously," Kratos said. "If he is focused on me, it is not focused on Aragorn's cell or the path to the crack of doom." "The crack of doom," Gimli repeated, his voice going flat. "You mean to destroy the ring." "The ring must be destroyed. Nothing else is sufficient." Kratos met the dwarf's eyes. "Frodo failed because he carried it too long, allowed it to work on him over months of travel. Someone else must carry it. Someone for a shorter time, along a faster route, with an army providing cover. Someone who has resisted the corruption of godhood before," Mary said quietly, understanding arriving in his eyes with the clarity of someone who had been waiting for the shape of the solution to emerge. "Someone who has already rejected power once." "I will not carry the ring," Kratos said immediately, and the firmness in his voice allowed no argument. Galadriel's vision had never left him, the image of himself crowned in shadow, Middle-earth prostrate before a new Dark Lord. He trusted his strength against most things. He did not trust it against an artifact specifically designed to exploit the desire to protect through power. "The ring cannot go to me. It must go to someone the ring would not consider worth corrupting." "A hobbit," Mary said, and something passed across his scarred face, the recognition of a burden returning that he had believed was carried by others and lost. "It has to be a hobbit again." "Can you do it?" Kratos asked directly, with the blunt respect of one warrior assessing another. "Knowing what it cost Frodo, knowing what it might cost you." Mary was quiet for a long moment. His burned hand rested flat on the table, and Kratos watched him look at it, at the scarring that mapped his encounter with darkness, with the expression of someone taking inventory of damage and deciding it had not yet reached the level of disqualifying. "Sam would do it without asking questions," Mary said finally. "Pippin would do it and make jokes the entire way because that's how he processes fear. I do it by being angry." A ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his weathered face. "I am very angry, so yes, I can do it." The plan was this. Legolas and Eowyn would lead a strike team of the Resistance's 30 best fighters through a drainage passage beneath Barad Minas' eastern wall, identified by a former prisoner who had maintained enough presence of mind during his captivity to memorize structural details, to reach Aragorn's cell in the lower dungeons. Gimli would lead a second team to the armory, located near the ring's current housing, creating the chaos necessary to provide cover for Mary's approach to the artifact itself. Kratos would enter through the front gate. Alone, at full power, with the explicit intention of making as much noise as possible for as long as possible, drawing every available orc, every Nazgul, every dark resource Sauron could direct, and holding them while the others completed their objectives. And if Sauron himself emerged, Kratos would face him directly. "That is not a distraction," Eowyn said, her voice carrying the careful flatness of someone controlling a strong reaction. "That is a sacrifice." "It is a calculated risk," Kratos replied. "With your life as the calculation." "My life has been calculated against worse odds," he said, "and the mathematics have consistently resolved in my favor." Eowyn held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes, he saw the complicated recognition of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and could not entirely argue against it while simultaneously being unwilling to simply accept it without acknowledgement. "If you die," she said finally, "we lose the only being in this world capable of standing against what stirs beneath Barad-dûr." "Then I will not die," Kratos said simply. Not until after. They moved on the fourth night, under a sky that had somehow darkened further, the pale smear of the sun completely invisible now behind permanent overcast. The earth trembled beneath their feet as they crossed the dead plains toward Barad Minas, not the sharp shock of earthquake, but the continuous, rhythmic trembling of something vast and patient approaching the threshold of wakefulness. Morgoth was running out of time to be contained. Kratos left the others at the point where their routes diverged, marking the moment with the economy of expression that had always been his mode, a look at each of them that communicated everything words would only diminish. Merry met his eyes last, the hobbit's scarred hand gripping the leather pouch that would hold the ring once Gimli's team secured it, and gave him a single firm nod that contained more courage per unit of expression than anything Kratos had witnessed since arriving in this world. Then he turned toward the gates of Barad Minas and walked forward alone. The fortress that had once been Minas Tirith was barely recognizable. 5 years of Sauron's architectural will had transformed the white city of Gondor into something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The pale stone, buried under dark construction that rose in brutal angles and cruel geometries. The seven-tiered structure remained beneath the modifications, like a skeleton dressed in someone else's skin, but the spirit of the place had been inverted. What had been built to inspire hope had been converted to communicate dominion. The gates were exactly as the SKP reports had described. Massive iron constructions, 3 times the height of the original, carved with the eye of Sauron in bas-relief detail so fine it seemed almost to move, watching, perceiving, recording. Kratos stopped before them and looked up at the eye. "I told your servant to inform you I was here," he said to the gates, to the eye, to whatever awareness lay behind it. "It appears you received the message." The gates had not opened. They did not need to. On the battlements above, hundreds of orcs had appeared silently, arrows nocked, crossbows loaded. From positions on either side of the gate, war trolls had emerged, their chains clanking, their armored hides gleaming with dark oil. And circling above, 3 of the Nazgul descended from the permanent darkness overhead, their fell beasts screaming with voices that pushed at the edges of sanity. Kratos took inventory of the opposition with the calm assessment of someone doing arithmetic. Hundreds of archers, multiple war trolls, 3 ringwraiths, and somewhere inside, Sauron's direct attention would be fixing itself on this confrontation, drawn away from the interior passages where his companions moved. Good, he needed Sauron looking outward, not inward. The Leviathan axe materialized with a crack of cold air, frost forming instantly in a radius around him. The blades of chaos erupted from their bindings, chains singing as they whirled in slow, deliberate arcs. Kratos felt the Spartan rage stirring deep in his chest, not releasing it yet, banking it, holding it as reserve fuel for what would come. "Open the gates," he said, his voice carrying across the silent battlefield with no effort required, "or I will open them myself." The orcs chose the second option. The arrows came first, hundreds of shafts darkening the air, a physical wall of projectiles that would have reduced any mortal to a pincushion, and any lesser supernatural being to something requiring significant recovery time. Kratos moved through them. Not entirely, several found purchase, punching through the gaps in his armor, drawing blood that steamed in the cold air. He felt each impact and cataloged it with the detachment of a warrior who had learned to treat his own wounds as tactical information rather than emotional events. Superficial, manageable, irrelevant. The Leviathan axe sang outward, trailing frost, taking a war troll through its armored knee before returning to his hand. The beast stumbled, its leg compromised, and the chain attached to its harness went slack. Kratos was already moving, the blades of chaos whirling outward and catching a second troll's chain, yanking it forward with enough force to send the massive creature stumbling into the gate itself with a crash that shook the foundations. The iron buckled, not broken, These gates had been built to withstand siege weapons, but the impact sent structural tremors through the construction that the orcs on the battlements felt through their feet, their formations wavering. The first Nazgul descended directly at him, its fell beast diving with the speed of a raptor, dark sword extended. Kratos tracked its approach with the precise timing of someone who had fought beings that moved faster, hit harder, and carried more malevolent intent than this ancient wraith. He stepped inside the sword's arc at the last possible moment, caught the ringwraith's wrist with one hand, and hurled it from its mount with enough force to send it crashing through the gate's bas-relief eye, the iron face of Sauron collapsing inward around the impacting body. The gates broke, not elegantly, not the clean breach of a siege engine working as designed, but with the brutal, irreversible finality of something shattered by a force that simply refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to hold. Kratos walked through the wreckage. The interior of Barad Minas opened before him like a nightmare geography, dark streets converting what had been Gondor's noble architecture into a maze of shadow and function. Every open space converted to parade ground or staging area or processing facility. The beautiful fountains and gardens of Minas Tirith buried under iron and stone. Orcs flooded toward him from every direction, a tide of dark bodies and flashing weapons, and Kratos met them with the cold fury of someone who had found a purpose equal to his capacity for destruction. He fought his way inward with methodical brutality, not seeking the fastest route but the loudest one, the path that would draw maximum attention, that would require maximum response, that would pull every available resource toward his position and away from the drainage passage where Legolas moved, the armory where Gimli worked, the dungeon where Aragorn waited. The Spartan rage he had been banking began to slip its controls, and he let it partially in controlled bursts, enough to amplify the spectacle without burning through his reserves. Divine fire blazed from his skin in pulses, and where the orcs pressing against him saw it, they faltered. They had been told this world was conquered. They had been told resistance was finished. They had not been told about this. He was deep in the former city's third tier, leaving a trail of destruction that would have concerned him in other circumstances, when he felt it. The temperature dropped. Not the natural cold of the Leviathan axe or the mountain air, but something deeper, a wrongness in the fabric of the world itself. As if reality had developed a crack, and something far too cold and far too old was breathing through it. The remaining Nazgul retreated. Every orc within 50 yards stopped fighting and simply ran, their discipline evaporating in the face of something they feared more than Kratos, more than death, more than failure. The earth trembled with new violence, not the rhythmic pulse of Morgoth's slow awakening, but something sudden and immediate and responding to the specific chaos of this moment. Sauron stepped from the shadows. Not a projection, not a manifestation through a servant's eyes or a palantir's glass. The Dark Lord himself, in physical form that he had not needed to assume in decades because no threat had required it. A towering figure in black armor that seemed forged from compressed darkness, the one ring blazing on his finger with golden light that somehow made the surrounding darkness worse by contrast. He was enormous, not in the simple physical sense, though his physical form exceeded mortal scale, but in the way that ancient powers were enormous, filling space beyond their physical boundaries with presence and will, and the accumulated weight of millennia of intent. The eye that appeared in flame atop Barad-dûr was a symbol. This was the reality behind the symbol. God-killer, Sauron said, and his voice carried the resonance of someone accustomed to speaking words that changed the world. You are persistent. I will grant you that. Kratos looked at the Dark Lord with the evaluating calm he had developed over a lifetime of facing beings that claimed supreme power. He had faced Zeus in his full divine authority. He had stood before Odin, the All-Father, and found him wanting. He had looked upon the face of absolute power and discovered it was never quite as absolute as it claimed. I have been called worse, Kratos replied, by better. Something flickered behind Sauron's terrible gaze, the closest equivalent to surprise that a being of his nature could achieve. He had spoken to conquerors, to kings, to the greatest warriors of every age, and they had all, eventually, inevitably, shown him fear. This ash-skinned warrior from beyond the circles of the world showed him nothing but cold assessment. "You cannot defeat me," Sauron said, and the conviction in his voice was genuine. This was not the boast of ego, it was the statement of a being who had calculated the outcome and seen it clearly. "I hold the One Ring. My power is complete. Even you, whatever you are, cannot overcome what I am." "Your power is complete over this world," Kratos said, the blades of chaos beginning to spin slowly, their chains carving arcs of fire through the cold air. "I am not of this world." He attacked. The collision of divine rage against dark dominion sent shockwaves through the surrounding architecture, stone cracking and expanding rings from the epicenter of impact. Sauron met the assault with the full force of the ring's power, sorcery that could unmake men's minds and reshape reality according to its bearer's will. And for the first time since Kratos had arrived in Middle-earth, he felt genuine resistance. Not the resistance of strength against strength, which he understood and could calibrate. This was the resistance of a reality being asserted against him, the world itself bending towards Sauron's will, attempting to make Kratos' actions ineffective not by stopping them, but by changing the rules by which they operated. The blades of chaos cut through a conjured shield of dark energy. Sauron gestured, and the ground beneath Kratos' feet became fluid, attempting to swallow him. He drove the Leviathan axe into the liquefied stone and anchored himself, pulling free through sheer physical determination. The ring blazed brighter, and a wave of crushing will hit him, not physical force but the psychic pressure of an ancient intelligence attempting to simply override his autonomy, to reach into his mind and command him to stop. He had resisted the commands of gods before. He had broken free of Ares' control at the cost of everything he loved. He had refused Odin's manipulation and Zeus's authority and the chains of fate itself. He refused this too. "Impossible," Sauron said, and now something had entered his voice that had not been there before. Not fear, a being of his nature did not fear in the conventional sense, but recalculation. The rapid reassessment of a strategist discovering that their model of the situation was incomplete. "I have broken impossible before," Kratos snarled, pressing the attack with everything he had. They fought across 3 tiers of the former city, their conflict leaving devastation in expanding circles. Sauron was enormously powerful, more powerful than anything Kratos had faced in this world, arguably as powerful as the greater Olympian gods in their prime. The One Ring amplified his natural authority into something that pressed against the edges of what Kratos' divine constitution could absorb. Kratos had one advantage that Sauron's calculations had not adequately accounted for. He had been killing gods since before most of Middle-earth's current age had begun. He knew how to fight beings of supreme power. He knew where the gaps were, where even absolute power had to commit to specific expressions and became temporarily vulnerable in the commitment. He exploited those gaps with brutal precision, each opening earning him purchase that he held against the Dark Lord's attempts to dislodge him. And crucially, he did not need to win. He needed to hold. He needed to occupy Sauron's full attention for long enough. Deep in Barad Minas' lower levels, Legolas's team moved through the drainage passage in single file, the elf's night vision guiding them through absolute darkness. They could hear the battle above, the crashes and concussions of Kratos and Sauron's collision transmitted through stone, and the sound oriented them, told them the distraction was holding. In the armory, Gimli's axe spoke in short, efficient sentences to the guards who had been left behind when the main force rushed toward the spectacle at the gate. The resistance fighters with him moved with the desperate efficiency of people who knew exactly how much time they had and refused to waste a moment of it. And in the dungeon's deepest cell, Aragorn, king of Gondor in a kingdom that no longer existed, heard the distant thunder of something impossible happening above him, and opened eyes that had been closed in the conservation of diminishing strength. He had maintained consciousness of the outside world through 5 years of imprisonment through the careful cultivation of hope as a discipline, not a feeling which came and went, but a practice, maintained regardless of circumstance. The thunder above him sounded different from Sauron's usual demonstrations of power. It sounded like a fight. And for something to be fighting Sauron at full strength, without immediately ceasing to be audible. The cell door exploded inward, and Legolas stood in the entrance with a look of fierce relief, barely contained beneath elvish composure. "Can you walk?" the elf asked. Aragorn looked at his legs, weakened, yes, but not broken, not permanently damaged, Sauron having been careful to preserve his most valuable prisoner. He looked at the cell that had been his world for 5 years, at the walls he had memorized in microscopic detail during the long hours when darkness was all there was. "I can run," he said. Above them, Kratos and Sauron tore the city apart in a battle that neither could quite win, the god-killer refusing to fall, the Dark Lord unable to deliver the finishing blow while maintaining the ring's broader functions. It was a stalemate that favored the resistance, buying seconds that became minutes that became the margin between failure and possibility. In the armory, Gimli's hand closed around a familiar shape, a small gold band, blazing with malevolent light, the heat of it wrong in a way that went beyond temperature. He dropped it immediately into the leather pouch Merry held open, and the hobbit sealed it with hands that shook only slightly. The ring was in Merry's keeping. The path to Mount Doom lay east, through territories the resistance had mapped with desperate care. And somewhere above them, the Ghost of Sparta was buying them every second he could at whatever cost it required. "Now," Merry said quietly, looking at the sealed pouch with the expression of someone who could already feel the weight of what it contained. "We go now, while he's still standing." They went. Kratos had been in worse situations. He repeated this to himself, as Sauron drove him through the wall of what had once been Gondor's great library, the ancient stone shattering around him like paper, centuries of preserved knowledge reduced to dust and scattered pages in a single impact. He hit the far wall, felt ribs crack with the familiar sensation of structural damage he had learned to categorize rather than react to, and was back on his feet before the debris finished settling. Worse situations, definitely. He had fought Poseidon while the world flooded around him. He had battled Kronos on a Titan's palm while the underworld opened beneath them. He had faced Zeus himself, the king of the gods, and beaten him to death with his own bare hands while Gaia crumbled beneath their feet. He had survived Baldur's assault, Sigrun's precision, the world serpent's wake. He had survived all of it. He would survive this. The problem was that survival was not the metric that mattered. Time was. Sauron advanced through the ruined wall with the terrible patience of something that had been waiting 3 ages of the world for this kind of dominion, and could afford to be methodical about exercising it. The one ring blazed on his finger with a light that had nothing of warmth in it, pure concentrated will, the distilled essence of a being who had invested everything he was into a single artifact, and then reclaimed it after its loss. He was at his apex. Complete in a way he had not been since the last alliance had broken his body and taken the ring from his severed hand. "You fight well," Sauron said, his voice carrying the genuine acknowledgement of someone who respected competence even in enemies. "Better than anyone I have faced in this age, but you are tiring." He was not wrong. The battle had lasted longer than Kratos had planned, extracted more from him than his most optimistic calculations had allowed for. Sauron's power was not merely physical, it was ontological, pressing against the foundations of Kratos' ability to function in this world, attempting to unmake the divine constitution that kept him standing through damage that would have killed anything native to Middle-earth 3 times over. The cracked ribs had company now. His left shoulder bore a wound from Sauron's mace that had not closed as quickly as it should have, the dark energy of the impact interfering with the regenerative capacity that had served him in two mythological worlds. His Spartan rage reserves were running low. The divine fuel burned through in the demands of this engagement. But somewhere beneath Barad Minas, his companions were moving. He could not know exactly where they were or what obstacles they had encountered, but he could calculate the minimum time required for each phase of their plan. He needed to hold for at least another 30 minutes. He could do 30 minutes. "I have been called many things," Kratos said, retrieving the Leviathan axe from where it had embedded in the far wall and squaring himself against the Dark Lord's advance. "Tired is not among them." Sauron raised the hand bearing the ring, and reality bent. Not metaphorically, physically, visibly. The air between them was distorting as the Dark Lord channeled the ring's full power into a single focused attack. This was what the ring was designed for, not the subtle corruption of lesser minds, but the overwhelming assertion of Sauron's absolute will made manifest as force. Kratos braced himself and let it hit. The impact was enormous. He was driven back through two more walls, through what had been a residential structure, through its far wall into an open courtyard. He landed on his back, looking up at the bruised sky, and took a moment to assess the damage with the clinical detachment of a warrior who had learned that panic was the enemy of recovery. Left arm functional but compromised. Right arm fully operational. Legs intact. Ribs additional damage, breathing is painful but not critically impaired. Head clear enough. Rage reserves dangerously low. He got up anyway. Sauron stood at the breach he had made, watching Kratos rise with an expression that had moved beyond recalculation into something that might have been. Not respect exactly, because a being of his nature did not offer respect to those he intended to destroy, but a form of recognition. The acknowledgement that this particular opponent required his complete attention in a way that nothing had in a very long time. "What are you?" Sauron asked, the question carrying genuine philosophical weight rather than tactical inquiry. "You are not of this world, not of any world I have perceived or corrupted. You carry divinity that does not belong to any pantheon I know. You resist what should be irresistible. What manner of being defies the mathematics of power so completely?" "A father," Kratos said, the word coming from somewhere beneath strategy and calculation, from the place where truth lived that he had spent decades learning to access rather than suppress. "A warrior, a man who has made every mistake available to him and chosen to keep moving anyway." Sauron stared at him. "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer that matters." Kratos raised the Leviathan axe, ignoring the protest of his compromised left arm. "Come, we are not finished." The Dark Lord came. The second phase of their combat was different from the first, slower, more deliberate, both combatants having exhausted the reserves that enabled spectacle and settling into the grim mathematics of attrition. Sauron's attacks became more precise, less overwhelming, targeted at the specific weaknesses the extended battle had revealed in Kratos' constitution. Kratos' responses became more economical, every movement stripped of anything unnecessary, operating on the minimum viable force required to survive each exchange while maintaining pressure. It was, in a strange way, the most honest fight Kratos had ever been in. No divine privilege. No rage as a shortcut. No overwhelming the opponent with power and speed before they could respond. Just two beings at or near their limits, finding out what remained when everything else was stripped away. What remained in Kratos was rage. Not the Spartan rage of his divine inheritance, that was nearly gone, but something older and quieter and more durable. The cold fury of someone who had witnessed too much destruction and chosen, at terrible personal cost, to stand against it. The anger that was not about himself but about the children in the iron cages, the slave columns grinding across dead earth, the people hiding in broken fortresses maintaining resistance because they could not bring themselves to stop. It was, he realized with something approaching wonder, the same thing that had sustained Aragorn through 5 years of imprisonment, the same thing that had kept Merry walking on a leg that should have been rested, the same thing that made Eowyn compress her grief into something sharper rather than simply surrendering to it. Hope was not a feeling these people possessed. It was a discipline they practiced because the alternative was to accept that darkness had won, and that acceptance was the one thing they refused. He had spent his whole existence fighting against things, against gods who had wronged him, against fate that had constrained him, against the world that had shaped him into something terrible. He had never understood until this broken world showed him what it meant to fight for things instead. He took a blow from Sauron's mace that should have ended the engagement, that drove him to one knee and sent stars across his vision, and he got up because somewhere in the passages beneath him, Merry carried a burden toward a mountain of fire, and that was something worth staying conscious for. "You cannot win this," Sauron said, standing over him with the ring blazing. "Accept it." "I do not need to win," Kratos said through blood and compressed breath. "I only need to hold." Confusion crossed the Dark Lord's terrible face. "Hold? Hold for what? There is nothing left in this world that can." The ground beneath Barad Minas convulsed. Not the rhythmic trembling of Morgoth's slow awakening. Something sharper, more violent, more immediate. A physical disruption that sent cracks racing across the courtyard stones, that toppled the remaining sections of wall around them, that caused Sauron himself to stagger as the foundations of his fortress shuddered beneath him. The one ring on Sauron's finger flickered. Just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the blazing gold light pulsing uncertainly, its radiance interrupted by some external factor that reached through the artifact's power to the reality underlying it. Kratos understood immediately, with the tactical clarity of a warrior who had spent 3 days planning for exactly this moment. Merry had reached the crack of doom. The ring flickered again, more dramatically this time, as the forces that had forged it reached toward the place of its making. Sauron felt it too. He looked at his hand with an expression of absolute disbelief, the expression of someone whose understanding of the universe had just been fundamentally revised. "Impossible," he whispered. The word had a different quality now than when he had applied it to Kratos' resilience. Then it had been recalculated. Now it was the sound of a foundation giving way. Kratos rose from his knee for what felt like the 100th time, and raised the Leviathan axe. "I told you," he said, "I have broken impossible before." He drove the axe into Sauron's chest with every reserve of strength remaining to him, channeling the last dregs of Spartan rage in a single focused strike that carried not just physical force, but the full weight of everything this fight had meant. The blow landed true, cracking the dark armor, driving through the layers of sorcery, and will that protected the Dark Lord's physical form. Sauron staggered backward, the ring flaring desperately as it attempted to compensate for its bearer's physical crisis, while simultaneously feeling the approach of the fire that had made it. The ground split open between them as another convulsion from Mordor's depths tore through the earth, a crack running across the courtyard that separated Kratos from his opponent. From the depths of that crack came a sound that he had heard described but never expected to encounter directly. A voice from the void, ancient and immense, and carrying the concentrated darkness of something that had been imprisoned for ages and was finally approaching the moment of release. Morgoth was waking. Not fully, not yet, but his consciousness was brushing against the surface of the world with increasing insistence, drawn by the specific resonance of Sauron's complete victory, and now confused, disturbed by the disruption occurring in the foundation of that victory. The trembling intensified until it became a continuous roar felt through the feet and the bones and the teeth. Around the fortress, Sauron's armies were dissolving into chaos. The orcs closest to Barad-dûr were fleeing in all directions, their disciplined formations shattered by the dual terror of the ground tearing open, and whatever they felt stirring below. The Nazgûl circled overhead in agitated patterns, their coordination broken by the flickering of the ring's authority. Sauron straightened, pulling himself upright through what was clearly enormous effort, the crack in his armor leaking a darkness that was not blood but something analogous. He looked at Kratos across the split courtyard, and the expression on his terrible face was one that Kratos had seen before. On the faces of gods in the moment they realized they were losing. Not fear, something more complex and in some ways more awful. The confrontation with the possibility that everything built, everything achieved, everything sacrificed and destroyed to reach this point might be undone by factors too small and too humble to have ever appeared in the calculations. "A hobbit," Sauron said, the words almost inaudible beneath the roaring earth. "You sent a hobbit." "The ring does not think hobbits are worth corrupting quickly," Kratos replied. "You taught me that. You built an artifact that looks for power, for ambition, for greatness to corrupt. And you forgot that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is someone with nothing to prove." The ring flickered a third time, and this time it did not recover. The golden light guttered like a candle in a gale, and across the entirety of Barad Minas, across the occupied territories of a conquered Middle-earth, across the slave columns and the patrol routes and the dark fortresses and the processing facilities, the eye blinked. Not went out, not yet, but for the first time in 5 years, the awareness that had pressed down on every living thing in Middle-earth like a physical weight faltered in its attention. A collective shudder ran through the enslaved peoples of a broken world. The sudden absence of constant surveillance felt as something between relief and bewilderment. Sauron screamed. It was not a sound produced by vocal cords or any conventional mechanism of noise. It was reality itself vibrating at the frequency of a supreme will being violated, an expression of anguish and fury, and the specific terror of losing what you had built your entire existence around. He turned away from Kratos, his attention wrenched toward Mordor and the mountain within it, and the small figure standing at the edge of the fire. Kratos did not allow him to turn fully. The blades of chaos erupted from their bindings one final time, chains whirling outward with the last genuine force available to him, and wrapped around Sauron's arm, the arm bearing the ring. With enough tension to prevent him from directing the full focus of his will toward the crack of doom. "You will look at me," Kratos snarled, planting his feet against the shuddering earth, every muscle in his body committed to holding the chains taut, "until it is done." Sauron pulled against the chains with the full force of his remaining power. Kratos held on. This was not combat. This was something more fundamental, a test of which force was more absolutely committed to its purpose. Sauron's commitment was to preserving the ring, to preventing the completion of the act that would unmake him. Kratos' commitment was to holding him long enough for someone else to complete the act he could not perform himself. He held. The chains burned against his hands, the dark energy of Sauron's struggle conducting through them like electrical current, scorching his palms through skin toughened by a lifetime of divine warfare. He held. The earth tore itself apart around them as Morgoth's consciousness surged toward the surface, drawn by the crisis occurring above him, the approaching dissolution of the victory that had been his signal. He held. And then, from somewhere inside the mountain of Mordor, across the miles between them, carried on air that had suddenly become electric with the release of ancient power. A sound like the world exhaling. The One Ring, cast into the crack of doom by hands that shook, but did not falter, consumed by the fires that had made it, unmade in the only place in all of Middle-earth where unmaking was possible. Sauron's scream changed pitch. The dark armor cracked from within, the physical form that had housed his will beginning to dissolve as the anchor that had sustained it was destroyed. The ring's light went out, not flickered, not guttered, but simply ceased as if it had never been. And with it the eye. Kratos released the chains and stepped back as Sauron came apart. The process was not immediate. A being of that magnitude, even unmade, required time to fully dissolve, but it was irreversible. The dark armor collapsed inward, the terrible presence that had filled it leaking away like smoke in the wind, the accumulated will of an ancient and terrible intelligence dispersing into the air of a world it would never again command. The Lord of Mordor had fallen, again, finally. Around the fortress, the armies of darkness dissolved into chaos and then into flight, the organizing intelligence that had given them purpose and direction gone completely. Orc battalions broke apart, the disciplined formations of 5 years of occupation shattering as their reason for coherence evaporated. The Nazgul, without the ring to sustain them, began to fade, their black forms growing translucent, then transparent, then simply absent, the ancient evil that had animated them finally released from its long servitude. Kratos stood in the ruins of the courtyard, the Leviathan axe hanging at his side, and watched the darkness lift. It was not instantaneous. It was not the clean resolution of a story reaching its intended conclusion. The darkness of 5 years of complete occupation did not simply evaporate because its architect had been destroyed. The slave columns would need to be freed. The fortresses would need to be dismantled. The dead earth would need seasons of recovery before it grew anything again. The people who had been broken would need something no military victory could provide: time, care, and the patient reconstruction of hope as a lived experience rather than a distant concept. But the darkness was lifting. Above Barad Minas, above the Pelennor fields, above the scarred and suffering lands of Gondor and Rohan and the Shire, the sky was beginning to change. The permanent overcast that had pressed down for 5 years was thinning, and through the gaps, impossibly beautiful against everything that had come before, appeared the blue. Actual blue, sky blue, the color of a world that had not entirely forgotten what it was supposed to be. Kratos looked up at it and felt something move in his chest that he did not immediately have words for. Not triumph. He had felt triumph often enough to recognize it, and this was different. Not relief, though relief was present. Something quieter and more fundamental, the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing a thing done correctly, of a debt partially paid, of a story arriving at a beat that made the preceding darkness worthwhile. He was still looking at the sky when he heard footsteps approaching through the rubble and turned to find Aragorn. The king of Gondor, for that was what he was now, whether he stood in a throne room or a shattered courtyard, moved with the careful dignity of someone who had maintained himself through 5 years of imprisonment through sheer force of will, and was only now allowing his body to acknowledge the cost. He was thinner than Kratos remembered, bearing the marks of his captivity in ways both visible and not, but his eyes held the same quality they always had: the stubborn, luminous insistence on meaning that no amount of darkness had managed to extinguish. Beside him, supported under one arm with elvish care, walked Frodo Baggins. Kratos had not expected this. The reports had described the ring-bearer as a prisoner of Barad Minas, a symbol of corruption displayed for the breaking of morale. What had not been adequately conveyed was how thoroughly 5 years of bearing that particular burden, first the ring's weight on the journey, then the weight of failure, then the weight of Sauron's deliberate exhibition of what he had become, had marked the Hobbit. Frodo was small even by Hobbit standards, and what remained of him seemed smaller still. But he walked, and his eyes were present, and when they found Kratos across the rubble-strewn courtyard, something moved in them that was neither the hollow emptiness of a broken spirit nor the fragile brightness of restored hope, but the complicated, realistic, hard-won expression of someone beginning the long process of reassembling themselves from the pieces that survived. "Legolas told me," Frodo said, his voice rough from disuse, "that you held Sauron, that you kept him from stopping Merry." "Merry did the difficult part," Kratos replied. Merry always does. The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed Frodo's ravaged face. That's the thing about hobbits. Everyone forgets about us until we do the impossible thing, and then they remember for a while and then they forget again. The ghost smile steadied slightly. I don't mind anymore. The forgetting. It means the world is normal enough that extraordinary things are surprising again. Kratos had no response to this that would not diminish it, so he said nothing, and Frodo seemed to understand that the silence was a form of respect. Aragorn placed a hand on Kratos' shoulder, carefully, aware that the god-killer was wounded in ways that made casual contact potentially unwise, but deliberately communicating something that transcended the physical gesture. You held, he said simply. When it mattered most, you held. I told you I would, Kratos replied. You told us you would not die until after. Aragorn's eyes swept across the devastated courtyard, the evidence of a battle that should not have been survivable, the marks of a confrontation between forces beyond mortal comprehension. I notice you are still standing. Barely, Kratos admitted, which was as close as he generally came to acknowledging limitation. Barely is enough, Aragorn said. Barely is everything. From deeper in the fortress, sounds reached them, the resistance fighters moving through the liberated corridors, the confused and frightened voices of enslaved people encountering freedom for the first time in years and not quite knowing what to do with it. Gimli's voice boomed somewhere in the middle distance, organizing with characteristic efficiency. Eowyn's voice carried the clear authority of someone who had been waiting years for permission to command openly and was not wasting a moment of it. And from further away, barely audible but unmistakable to ears attuned to it, Merry's voice, exhausted, unsteady but present and alive, and carrying the particular quality of someone who had done the impossible thing and was still surprised to be around to know it. The long work of liberation had begun. It would take months, perhaps years. The reconstruction of a broken world was not accomplished in a night, no matter how decisive the night's events. But the darkness had a ceiling now, and through that ceiling, light was already beginning to find its way. The trembling did not stop. Kratos noticed it first, because he had trained himself to notice things that others categorized as background, the subtle wrongness that preceded catastrophe, the environmental detail that experienced warriors learned to read as warning before conscious analysis caught up with instinct. He noticed it in the soles of his feet, through the cracked stones of the courtyard, a vibration distinct from the settling tremors of a fortress whose structural integrity had been severely compromised by the battle that had just occurred. This was rhythmic, patient, deep in the way that only things of immense age and mass could be deep. Morgoth had not stopped waking simply because Sauron had fallen. The realization arrived with the cold clarity of a tactical assessment that changed every calculation simultaneously. He had understood, intellectually, that the original Dark Lord's stirring was connected to, but not entirely dependent on Sauron's victory. But some part of him had allowed the hope that destroying the One Ring and breaking Sauron's dominion would interrupt the awakening, that removing the signal which had called to Morgoth from the void would cause whatever process had begun to simply cease. That hope was wrong. If anything, the destruction of Sauron had accelerated the process. The dissolution of the Dark Lord's physical form had released energies that rippled through Mordor's geology like shockwaves, and those shockwaves were reaching something beneath the earth that had been dormant for ages and was now, in the specific resonance of that release, finding its rhythm disrupted into wakefulness rather than continued sleep. Kratos crossed the courtyard to where Aragorn stood with Frodo and Legolas, moving with the careful haste of someone managing serious wounds while refusing to allow them to dictate pace. "The ground," he said without preamble. "It has not settled." Aragorn had noticed too. The king's eyes had taken on the focused distance of someone processing multiple streams of information simultaneously, his hand resting on his sword with the unconscious readiness of a lifetime of vigilance. "It has been like this for weeks," he said quietly. "We felt it even in the dungeons. The guards were afraid of it. Even Sauron's servants, the ones who feared nothing, would not speak of what caused it." "Morgoth," Legolas said, the name falling from his lips with the weight of something too large to hold comfortably. The elf's ancient eyes were fixed on the eastern horizon, toward the dark peaks of Mordor's mountain ranges, and his expression carried the particular quality of someone whose millennia of memory contained things more terrible than what others could imagine. "I had hoped," he paused, revising. "I had wanted to believe that with the ring destroyed, the connection would sever. That whatever had been awakened would return to dormancy." "It has not," Kratos said. "No." Legolas turned from the horizon, and what Kratos saw in his eyes was not despair. The elf had moved beyond despair's reach through long familiarity with it, but something that required more courage than despair did. The willingness to confront a new impossibility immediately after surviving an old one, without the recovery period that would make the confrontation feel manageable. "It has not." Gimli emerged from the fortress interior at something close to a run, which for a dwarf represented extreme urgency communicated through maximum available speed. His axe was still in his hand, and his expression had bypassed alarm entirely in favor of the grim practicality of someone who had decided that feeling things appropriately could wait until after the crisis had been addressed. "The foundations," he said without ceremony. "Something is moving in them, not settling, moving. The resistance fighters in the lower levels are reporting cracks opening in the bedrock, and what is coming through those cracks is not groundwater." "What is it?" Aragorn asked. Gimli met his eyes with the direct solemnity of a dwarf who had spent his life underground and understood stone in all its moods and meanings. "Dark fire, the kind that burns without consuming. The kind." He paused, and in the pause, Kratos heard the weight of dwarven memory surfacing, the ancestral knowledge of what lived in deep places, that the Khazad know from the oldest stories. The fire that was here before the world was shaped. Morgoth's fire, the darkness that preceded creation, the negation of light that the original Dark Lord had wielded before his imprisonment in the void. If it was reaching upward through Barad-dûr's foundations, then the awakening was not a gradual process anymore. It was imminent. Kratos assessed himself with the brutal honesty the situation demanded. His ribs were cracked, his left shoulder compromised, his palms burned from the blades of chaos channels conducting Sauron's dark energy. His Spartan rage was effectively depleted, requiring time he did not have to replenish. The Leviathan axe retained its power, and the blades of chaos their capability, but the warrior wielding them was operating well below optimal capacity against an opponent who would require everything he possessed, and perhaps more. He had fought worse odds. He kept returning to this fact not as reassurance but as an accurate historical record: the Greek gods, the Norse pantheon, the entirety of Olympus arrayed against him. He had survived. He had prevailed. Not always cleanly, not always without cost so great it bordered on catastrophic, but the outcomes had consistently resolved in his favor. But those battles had been his to fight for personal reasons, and he had carried into them the rage of personal grievance, the fuel of vengeance and survival. This battle would require something different. He could feel it, the particular quality of the confrontation approaching, the sense that brute force and divine fury would be necessary but not sufficient. He needed the thing that had actually won this war. Not his strength, not his god-killing capability. The thing that Merry had demonstrated at the crack of doom, that Aragorn had demonstrated through 5 years of imprisonment, that all of them had demonstrated by simply continuing when continuation seemed irrational. He needed to fight for something beyond himself, with everything that remained, and trust that it would be enough. "Listen carefully," Kratos said, turning to address Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli with the focused authority of a general delivering final orders before a battle that allowed no revision. "The liberation of this fortress is your responsibility now. The people freed from the slave columns, the prisoners from the cells, everyone who survived Sauron's occupation. They need leadership, and you are the only leaders left who have the authority to provide it. You are not including yourself in this, Aragorn said. It was not a question. What comes next from those foundations, Kratos replied, is not a battle for armies or kings or freed prisoners. It cannot be fought with hope and courage and the willingness to stand, because those things are weapons against darkness that operates through subjugation and fear. What stirs beneath this place is older than that. It is the darkness that existed before hope was invented as a concept. Then how do you fight it? Eowyn asked, emerging from the fortress entrance behind Gimli, Merry supporting himself against her shoulder with the careful dignity of someone refusing to be carried when walking was technically possible. Kratos looked at her, and then at Merry, and felt something move in his chest with the quality of recognition. He had asked himself this question about every impossible fight he had ever undertaken, and the answer had always been the same, even when he had not understood it clearly enough to articulate. The same way you fight everything, he said. You go toward it and you do not stop. The descent into Barad-dûr's foundations was not a strategic maneuver. There was no tactical approach, no infiltration route, no plan built from intelligence gathered over days of careful preparation. There was only the cracked stone stairway that led from the fortress's lowest accessible level into the geology beneath, and the light of the Leviathan axe's frost casting pale blue illumination into darkness that seemed to actively resist it. Kratos descended alone. The temperature dropped with each level, and the quality of the darkness changed, thickened, became textured, acquired the specific density of something that was not merely the absence of light, but the presence of its opposite, anti-light. The darkness that had preceded the creation of illumination in this world's cosmology, leaking upward through the cracks in ancient stone as something immense and patient and unutterably old, pulled itself toward consciousness. The cracks Gimli had described were everywhere, fractures in bedrock that should have been stable for geological ages, their edges scorched with the dark fire that burned without consuming, casting no light but somehow making the darkness visible in a way that ordinary darkness was not. Through these cracks came the sound of Morgoth's awakening. Not a voice, not a roar, not anything that required the apparatus of communication, but a pressure, a will. The assertion of something that had existed before will was something you needed to assert because you simply were, completely and without question. He reached the lowest level the stairs could access and stopped. Before him, the floor had ceased to exist. The foundations of Barad-dûr opened into a space that should not have been there, vast and dark, a cavern created not by geological process, but by the withdrawal of something that had occupied the space for longer than the fortress above had stood. In that space, visible in the dark fire illumination of its own essence, something was taking shape. Not fully formed, not fully present, Morgoth existed in the void, had been cast there by the combined power of the Valor, and the barrier between the void and the material world was not something that could be fully crossed from within, regardless of the power seeking to cross it. But the barrier was thin here, worn by Sauron's ages of dark industry above it, by the specific resonances of the One Ring's making and unmaking, by the accumulated weight of all the suffering that had been generated in this place, and seeped downward like a slow poison into the boundary between world and void. What Kratos faced was not Morgoth's complete. It was Morgoth reaching through, projecting a fraction of his awareness and power through a gap that was widening with each tremor, each crack in the stone, each moment that Sauron's fall continued to resonate through the geological fabric of Mordor. A fraction of Morgoth's power was still more than anything currently walking Middle-earth's surface could reasonably be expected to survive. Kratos stepped forward anyway. The projection resolved as he approached, vast and dark and cold with the absolute cold of the void, a form assembled from anti-light and ancient malevolence that suggested shape without committing to it. that implied a face without providing one, that communicated presence through the simple, overwhelming fact of existing in a space, and filling it with will so complete that other wills felt the pressure of displacement. Kratos had stood in the presence of primordial forces before, chaos in the depths of Tartarus, the world serpent whose existence predated the current cycle of creation. Ymir, the primordial giant from whose body the Norse cosmos had been constructed. He had learned to assess such beings not by their scale, which was always incomprehensible, but by the specific quality of their awareness, what they perceived, what they responded to, what they could be made to focus on. Morgoth perceived him. He felt it, the attention of something ancient fixing on this new presence in the space, reading him with senses that operated on fundamentally different principles than sight or sound or any conventional means of perception. Reading the divine heritage, the God-killing history, the specific quality of a being from outside this world's cosmological structure. And then Morgoth did something Kratos had not anticipated. He spoke, not through sound, but through a direct communication that bypassed the mechanics of language entirely and deposited meaning in the mind, without requesting permission to enter. The experience was violating in the specific way that only intrusion into consciousness could be, and Kratos felt his jaw clench against the instinctive rage it provoked. The meaning that arrived was this: you are not of this world. You cannot stop what I am. You are a visitor in a story whose ending was written before your universe existed. Kratos considered this for a moment. Then he raised the Leviathan axe and answered in the language he had always been most fluent in. The axe struck the projection's nearest manifestation with a crack of cold and divine force that sent shockwaves through the underground chamber, and the dark fire where the blow landed guttered and sparked and responded not with pain. Something like Morgoth did not process pain in any conventional sense, but with the kind of reaction a vast, slow intelligence produces when something unexpected occurs. Surprise, ancient, cosmic, and therefore entirely unaccustomed to itself. You cannot wound what is not here, Morgoth communicated. You are here enough, Kratos replied aloud, because he had learned that speaking aloud in the presence of things that communicated through direct mental impression was a way of asserting the primacy of his own framework over theirs. And I am here entirely. That is sufficient difference. He attacked with the comprehensive commitment of someone who had decided that technique and strategy mattered less in this moment than absolute refusal to stop. The Leviathan axe drove through manifestations of dark energy, each strike forcing the projection to redirect attention and power to respond. The blades of chaos found the edges of Morgoth's reaching consciousness and cut along them, not seeking to sever. Nothing he possessed could sever an entity of this magnitude, but seeking to push, to compress, to communicate through physical force the simple, unambiguous message that this direction was blocked, that coming through here, into this world through this gap, would not be unopposed. Morgoth's response was not fury. Fury was a quality of things that had something to protect, something at stake. His response was the cold, patient pressure of something immense encountering an obstacle and applying itself to it with the thoroughness of geological force. The chamber walls cracked further. The dark fire intensified. The gap in the boundary between void and world strained toward widening. Kratos fought back with everything remaining to him and felt it was not enough. He had known it would not be enough. He had known since the moment Legolas said the name that no version of this confrontation ended with the God-Killer defeating the original darkness in single combat. That was not the shape of this battle. This was not a fight for victory. It was a fight for something more specific and more achievable. Time again, always time. He needed the gap to hold long enough, the awakening to be delayed long enough, for the forces that actually had the power to reseal what Morgoth was trying to open to be called. Above him, beyond the stone and the dark fire and the increasing violence of the earth's response to what moved within it, he knew that Gandalf's spirit had been cast beyond the circles of the world, not destroyed. And he knew, from the lore the wizard had shared during their ride to Gondor, that beyond the circles of the world lay Valinor, and in Valinor were powers that had faced Morgoth before, had imprisoned him before, were, perhaps, already aware that their ancient enemy was reaching for the gap his greatest servant's final downfall had inadvertently created. He needed to hold the gap until those powers responded. He planted the Leviathan axe in the cracked stone of the chamber floor, wrapped both hands around its haft, and channeled through it every reserve of divine energy remaining to him, not as an attack but as a barrier, a ward, a statement in the language of divine force that this gap was contested, and any further widening would meet active resistance rather than simply geological compliance. The dark fire raged against it. The void pressed through the narrowing gap with patient, enormous force. Kratos held the channel open through sheer committed will, his body screaming with the demands placed on it, the burns on his hands intensifying where divine energy conducted through wounded flesh, the cracked ribs protesting with each breath required to sustain the effort. He held. Above him, in the ruins of Barad Minas and across the suddenly free lands of Middle-earth, something was happening that he could not see but could somehow feel through the connection his warding had established with the fabric of this world. The sky was changing, not the gradual revelation of blue that had accompanied Sauron's fall, but something more sudden and more absolute. A light was coming from the west, from over the sea, from the direction of Valinor, carrying the specific quality of divine authority that Kratos recognized, because he had been born into a world full of it. The Valar were responding. Their intervention arrived not as physical presence. They could not simply step into the material world, but as a strengthening of the barrier itself, a reinforcement of the boundary between void and world that Morgoth was pressing against, channeled through the specific point of resistance that Kratos had established with his warding. His effort became the anchor point for something enormously larger than himself, the haft of the Leviathan axe serving as a conduit for forces that made his own divine heritage feel modest by comparison. Morgoth pressed harder as he felt the barrier reinforcing, the projection intensifying in a final surge that drove Kratos to both knees, the stone cracking beneath him, the dark fire overwhelming the frost of the axe in waves that tested the limits of what his constitution could absorb. Kratos did not release the axe. "Not today," he said through clenched teeth, to Morgoth, to the darkness, to whatever corner of the universe was listening. "Not this world, not while I am standing in it." The Valar's reinforcement completed its channel through him. The barrier slammed closed with a concussion that felt like the world itself inhaling sharply after a long period of holding its breath. The dark fire went out, instantly, completely, as if it had never been. The projection of Morgoth's consciousness, cut off from the gap that had been sustaining it, dissolved back into the void with the slow, terrible patience of something that had been imprisoned before and understood that imprisonment, however frustrating, was not permanent. Only waiting. The chamber was suddenly dark in the ordinary way, the darkness of underground space without light, carrying no malevolence, no anti-light, nothing but the simple physical absence of illumination. The Leviathan axe's frost reasserted itself in that darkness, casting its pale blue glow across stone that was cracked but stable geology that had been stressed to its limits and held. Kratos released the axe haft and sat down on the cracked stone of the chamber floor, because standing was no longer a project he could sustain, and took stock of what remained. He was alive. This continued to surprise him less than it probably should. The wounds he had accumulated across the two engagements, Sauron's assault above, Morgoth's projection below, had reached a cumulative total that would have been described, in clinical terms, as severe. His body was already beginning the divine regeneration that had served him across two mythological worlds, the process slower than normal due to the quantity and quality of damage sustained, but functioning. He would recover. Not quickly, and not without significant discomfort, but the direction was toward restoration rather than deterioration. He sat in the dark and breathed, and let that be enough for a moment. Above him, he heard footsteps on the stone stairs. Multiple sets, the careful tread of people descending into uncertain territory while maintaining enough presence of mind to move quietly. He recognized Aragorn's particular gait, Legolas's near-silent step, and Gimli's deliberate weight distribution. And behind them, slower, the irregular rhythm of Merry's compromised walk. They had come down after him, despite his explicit instruction to focus on the liberation above. They had come down because that was what these people did. They followed each other into impossible places because the alternative was to wait in safety while someone else bore the weight alone, and that alternative was not compatible with who they were. Kratos found he could not be angry about it. The light of torches filled the chamber, and he saw their faces as they took in the scene. The cracked stone, the extinguished dark fire, the closed gap in the boundary between world and void, and the god-killer sitting in the middle of it, all looking like he had been through something that would have killed anything else. Gimli let out a breath that contained approximately 3 months of suppressed anxiety compressed into a single exhalation. Legolas closed his eyes briefly with the expression of someone offering wordless thanks to a universe that had, for once, resolved a situation without requiring the worst possible outcome. Merry sat down on the bottom step with the careful relief of someone whose leg had reached its absolute limit and was now presenting that fact as non-negotiable. Aragorn descended to where Kratos sat and crouched before him, studying the wounds with the experienced eye of someone who had spent decades as a wandering healer as well as a warrior. "Can you stand?" he asked. Eventually, Kratos replied. "Then we will wait," Aragorn said simply, and sat beside him on the cracked stone floor of the most defeated place in Middle-earth, in the darkness that was now only darkness, and waited with the patient loyalty of someone who had learned that waiting alongside was sometimes the most important thing you could do. They sat together in the chamber beneath Barad-dûr as the world above them began, slowly and painfully, and with full acknowledgement of how much work remained to heal. The gap was sealed, the darkness had retreated, and Morgoth, denied his threshold, returned to his waiting in the void, patient as only something genuinely immortal could be patient, aware that ages would pass, that the world would change in ways he could not currently predict, that opportunities would arise again. But not today. Today, the gap had been held by someone who had no reason to hold it except that people needed it held, and that had proven sufficient. For today, that was everything.